You're listening to Convenience Matters, brought to you by NACS. We'll talk about what we see at stores and what the future may hold for our industry.
President Biden delivered his second annual State of the Union address. He covered some big themes, and some of them have implications for convenience stores. That's our topic today. Joining us today is NACS General Counsel Doug Kantor. Welcome, Doug.
Thank you for having me.
So, Doug, you've paid attention to the State of the Union for many, many years. You probably look at it differently. And what we're going to do is we're not going to look at it the way the pundits look at it on TV. We're not looking at it from a political bent. We're looking at it from a pro-convenience store bent. But how do you look at the State of the Union when it's presented? Do you look at applause lines? Do you look at themes? Do you look at how he starts or ends? What's the whole process when you dissect a State of the Union?
So one of the biggest things with the State of the Union is what's the relationship between the president and Congress? Usually you get that in perhaps more subtle ways where there's applause lines or not, there's quiet or not, and that tells you quite a bit about the extent to which there's broad bipartisan agreement on things or some real disagreement. This year, what is sometimes subtle was no longer subtle. We've gone from just over a decade ago, Joe Wilson, congressman from South Carolina, yelling, "You lie," at Barack Obama during a State of the Union address, and people called for him to have to resign from Congress. Last night, that was tame compared to some of the commentary and interruptions and back and forth. It was almost a conversation now as opposed to just a State of the Union speech. So that's a big change in the State of the Union. I think it says a lot about our country and our politics generally, but it also tells you there's going to be some friction, even in a speech where many of the themes were bipartisanship and working together.
So let's go through a couple of those themes, and let's start. He talked a bit about oil and gas, and believe he went off script when he talked about some of the profits and how come oil companies aren't putting money back in. And then he, unscripted, it sounds like, said, but we expect that oil and gas will be around for another decade. So what to make of all of that discussion that he had?
Only a decade.
Yeah, only a decade.
The decade was a significant observation. Yes. So there is no one out there predicting that gas will only be around for a decade. The most wildly optimistic scenarios are something along the lines of 50% of new cars sold in 2030 might be EVs.
And that's optimistic for EV people.
That's optimistic for EV people. Mm-hmm. I will tell you, I would be shocked if we get to that level for lots of reasons. Part of it, which is it's not clear we have the capacity to generate that much electricity. But set aside all the practical problems, it's clear this president is a big advocate of EVs. It's clear the Democratic Party, for the most part, are big advocates of EVs. And we've seen that in federal policy in the infrastructure bill last year that the president talked about. We've seen it in state policies where some states have talked about either mandating a certain number of so-called zero-emission vehicles or banning new car sales of internal combustion engines. But it's worth noting, even those states like California that say we want to ban sales of internal combustion engines, that's only for new cars. And the truth of the matter is, what many people can miss, most cars bought every year are used. So there's a lot of cars out there that will be around for an awfully long time that will continue to run on gasoline in big numbers. But we do need to be aware as an industry of where this president and quite a few of his supporters in Congress want to go.
Well, I think car ownership's about 10 years, right?
It's
creeped up, actually. Yeah. It's about 12 now. And look, with the policies we've got out there, you might expect that to creep up even higher because electric vehicles, whatever you think of them, are pretty high-end vehicles for the most part. Not a lot of people can buy those, particularly new, and there's not much of a used car market for electric vehicles either.
That's a good point.
So is there anything that retailers need to think about or do or message? Because it was little discussion on big oil. I'm using air quotes right now, is somebody that needs to work with him, but there's going to be gas around for a while. So is there a way to delineate that? If we look at last year's oil prices, average price was about $4 a gallon, 75% was of the price of a gallon of gas was upstream. It was either the cost of crude or the cost of refining. 13% was taxes. Don't have anything to do with that. So the last 12% is distribution and marketing, according to EIA. I know people are going to say, well, 12%, that's too much. But is there something that retailers need to think about in terms of messaging? Is it, we need to talk more about local. We need to talk more about options. What can be done? And is there something more broadly that can be done?
So there are a number of things. One is on the gasoline side, retailers do need to get the message out there about how they are squeezed, especially how they are squeezed with higher prices and the way margins compress as prices go up. It's something that policymakers have started to understand, but a lot of the public doesn't understand it and assumes retailers make a lot more money than they do. So there's plenty of education there. The other thing we need to talk about is how our customers need our industry, right? People do drive their cars. They need them to get to work. They need them to get the kids to school and to practices and all kinds of other things. It's a big problem if suddenly gasoline were going to disappear. It's not going to, and there's really important reasons for it. Look, there's reasons why the industry was designated as essential by the Department of Homeland Security during the pandemic, when lots of stores of certain kinds had to close, and movie theaters and you name it. Convenience stores and gasoline stations were designated essential. And we need to talk about how we are essential parts of the community and what people do every day.
So let's talk about junk fees for a second, because that was interesting.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I haven't paid too much attention to it, but anything that comes out of Washington, usually the devil is in the details. So while on the consumer end, it's probably like, yeah, okay, that's cool. But from a business side, what are your initial thoughts on what we need to perhaps pay a little attention to?
Well, there's a couple of things. First of all, I think what will come immediately to mind for convenience retailers across the country is we've got some junk fees that they can look at, right? Swipe fees that merchants get charged are huge. And yes, they are junk too, or we would certainly...
That's a calm down word.
That is the adequate for the podcast word.
Yes,
that
we don't want that
here.
label that we can only have a limited audience for this episode.
Exactly. Now, it's probably helpful to our efforts on swipe fees that the president wasn't talking about swipe fees. In fact, before legislation on swipe fees was even introduced, the credit card industry started advertising against it by saying this is Joe Biden's idea because he's politically unpopular. So we don't need him to be out there advocating for our legislation, but there are clear parallels. Look, the credit card companies mistreat retailers in much the same way they mistreat individual consumers, and that's not lost on the regulators who we talk to regularly, who listen very closely to the State of the Union address for policy signals about what they should be doing. So with respect to the Federal Trade Commission, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the Federal Reserve, the Department of Justice, those agencies that can really help potentially retailers with our own junk fees, that was a useful thing and will fall into some of the same themes. And the president raised it in the context of antitrust legislation, which most people think of rightfully as the tech companies and social media, but he also mentioned platforms. And the point we've made for quite a while on this is the original platforms who were pioneers of all the ways that the technology platforms disadvantage people are Visa and MasterCard. So I do think it was helpful, perhaps inadvertently, but we are riding a bit of a wave of populist sentiment against things like junk fees and big antitrust problems.
So Taylor Swift is going to be our solution to swipe fees.
We'll take anything we can
You
get
need to
on
calm
this, Jeff.
Hey, I got that. So I guess some of the things that convenience stores are involved in everything. So you wonder, is there going to be something about labor? Is there going to be something about supply shortages? Any of these other things? The pandemic seemed to be a little low key, kind of setting up its over in May in terms of official declaration. But two big issues. So we talked about gas and oil. We talked about junk fees. Was there anything else from your standpoint that you felt just rose above that convenience stores, owners, suppliers might want to pay attention to because you were paying attention to what was said last night?
So there are a number of things, but the first one I'll mention is non-compete agreements. The Federal Trade Commission has proposed making non-compete agreements illegal entirely. Some states have rules around these agreements already, but for the Federal Trade Commission to propose it is a big deal. It has been very controversial, not least bit because they probably don't have the legal authority to do that at the Federal Trade Commission. But the president did talk about it some last night, and that's going to be something the industry has to deal with because there are a lot of very senior executives who do have non-compete agreements. We would argue for good reason, but the administration has talked about very low-level hourly workers. I think that's a rare thing and not something our industry is doing with non-compete agreements. So that'll be hashed out over time, but it is worth watching because there's at least a small percentage chance that could restructure the way a lot of businesses work with their executives and compensate them.
So of the issues that that President Biden brought up last night, and anybody who watched it probably did see the back and forth and how the political environment is a little warped these days in DC. Is there anything that you think the Democrats and Republicans would actually agree on?
Yes, because they'll have to. It's part of the design of the system is eventually, after all the posturing, the sides have to come together, or there's somewhat catastrophic results that nobody wants and nobody wants to be blamed for. Right. So obviously the debt ceiling was a lot of the conversation, and last night, and will continue to be for months. And at some point, the debt ceiling will get raised. The only question is how much pain will be inflicted by political conflict before that happens. And then what policy things surround that. The president said he's not negotiating around the debt ceiling, but he's willing to have conversations about budget cuts or discipline, however you want to frame it, at the same time. Now, is that a distinction without a difference? Maybe. But at some point, they will have to come together around that because we saw this happen in 2011. When they don't, stock markets start to crash. The credit rating of the United States becomes endangered. Lots of bad things happen. So they will deal with that. They will obviously pass funding bills to fund the federal government, hopefully without a shutdown. But you never know. Sometimes we've had shutdowns of a temporary nature. So certainly those things will happen. Other things out on the horizon, you can expect a defense bill, right? The Congress passes one of those every year. We're up for a farm bill this year. So there's places where there's a lot of agreement.
SNAP's in the farm bill.
Absolutely. Yeah. SNAP, among other things, is in the farm bill. So they will agree and come together. But this is a new Congress that is just getting its sea legs. It'll take a little time, even for them to figure out where's the sweet spot of being able to legislate?
So in looking at where it goes from here, I think a lot of people look at the State of the Union as the Super Bowl because they're right around the same time. But it really is the opposite of the Super Bowl. The Super Bowl is the end of the season. It's more like the Daytona 500, where it's the start of a season, where the State of the Union is most likely what President Biden will run on, at least for the next year, if not for the next 4 years after the next presidential election, if he decides to run. So how will this manifest itself over the next couple months? So there's things that obviously NACS does on Capitol Hill in telling the story. There's obviously things that everyone in the industry can do. For one, Day on the Hill, right? Go to that in March. Sign up online at convenience.org.
/Day on the Hill.
Day on the Hill. There you go. But so how will this manifest itself over the next couple months? Will we? What can we look for, both small and subtle and major?
So it's actually a very good point you raised, that this waves the starter's flag in a lot of ways, especially for the administration. One way to look at the State of the Union that a lot of people don't think about is the executive branch of the federal government is a very large, diverse organization. And the State of the Union is one of the few times that the president gets to speak to all of these various agencies within the federal government and point them in a direction. And that's part of why these speeches sometimes devolve into laundry lists, because he's got to hit on everyone's priorities. But this tells them, go forth and prosper and make policy. So we should see more administrative policy, rulemakings, and the like now moving forward at a greater clip, because the president has made his statement on all of these things. At the same time, it does set the agenda for the year in some ways with respect to the Congress, and they'll see what they have to deal with the president, especially in the Senate, which is still controlled by Democrats. They'll want to follow their president. And as you note, all of this does set up a political year in 2024 where there's big questions around who runs and what happens. So this was seen very much as the starting gun for all of those things.
So I like how you kind of weaved in William Shatner there with the line, given that when we talked about the State of the Union last year, you're right around him in terms of downloads, top 5 all time, top 3 all time. Obviously, this resonates with our members and just taking us inside baseball and just kind of giving us a behind the scenes look. What besides the State of the Union are you looking at that might be of interest to folks in our industry to pay attention to on Capitol Hill or even in regulatory atmosphere?
So one of the behind the scenes things that we watch very closely, but most people don't really see, is the way Congress organizes itself every year. And what members get put on which committees is a scramble every time there's a new Congress. And they've just been making those decisions in both the House and the Senate in the past couple of weeks. Now, as those committees organize and begin their regular business of hearings and considering legislation, they too each have to figure out what are the working relationships, how are these committees going to move forward, how much are they going to try to be bipartisan at first versus immediately abandoning that idea and being partisan. That's always a struggle for committee chairs. So that's the kind of thing we're watching, is what's the tone they're going to set early on? How do you move things through these committees and then ultimately to the floor? And some of that remains to be seen, but the president did make clear he at least wants to appear to be bipartisan and work with folks. I think that will be reciprocated. You saw Speaker McCarthy, really interesting at the speech last night. One, in talking to President Biden last week, McCarthy sounded positive notes, and sounded like he wanted to be bipartisan. And last night, significantly, you saw him trying to shush his own members from interrupting during the speech. I think that's a little microcosm of the dynamic we may see play out in the House of Representatives, where the members who have been around realize that they don't want the Republican conference to look obstructionist. They want it to look like they're trying to be practical and bipartisan, but they have a lot of members who are not necessarily as interested in that approach.
Well, as always, Washington, there's never a dull moment. And Doug, we want to thank you for being on today. And as these issues keep coming up, as they start to transpire in Washington, we'll certainly pull you back to the microphone and get you on another podcast, and we can do some more deep dives into these issues. But thank you for listening to Convenience Matters, everyone who's listening. And thanks, Doug, for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Convenience Matters is brought to you by NACS and produced in partnership with Human Factor. For more information, visit convenience.org.